Hello there, welcome to another workshop upgrade build video. In this one I'm building this router, table and lift in one system. As you can see, you can raise the bit from the top and then it ends up doing a fairly decent job of routing. So yeah, I'll talk you through the process of building that. So if you're also looking at building a router lift, you will have probably also done a lot of research on YouTube looking for a design that suits your needs. And in my case, that need was simplicity and cost. I found this video by GVM Corner and I thought the design was fantastic. It's super easy, not very many components, and cheap, which as you can see was exactly what I was looking for. I stuck pretty faithfully to this design and I'm going to talk through it here. So obviously you start with a base, which in my case was 18mm plywood. I routed out a little hole for the router to sit in because that was a bit too thick for the plunge mechanism. There's then that series of nuts, bolts and threaded rod, which will ultimately allow you to use the lift, which works because it's all attached via some hooks and chain through these metal pipes. So when you twist that lead screw, that twists all the rest of the nuts, bolts and threaded rod, which runs through a bit of wood which has a threaded insert. So the bit of wood will go up and down depending on the direction you twist it, and that will in turn move those metal pipes up and down because they're attached to the wooden block. That's going to make more sense when we build, so probably best just to stick around for that. First thing to do then is just to take off the base plate because that's not going to be there in the final router lift that I build, and then I can use the router itself to figure out how big I want the router table top to be. With that sketched out, I can just take the cross section of that to find the dead center, and then I can put a pointed router bit inside of the router which will allow me to get it exactly centered, as you can see there. Now if you're eagle-eyed, you can see I've put the base plate back on to do this, and that's because once I've got this in position and squared it up, I actually need to translate the bolt holes so I have some means of mounting the router to this plate. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm sketching out the bolt holes and that's done, as you can see. I then punch where those are so that the drill bit doesn't wander as I start to drill, and then I do my best to keep the drill straight as I drill through. And this was the biggest problem I had in this whole build because I don't have a drill press and these were not straight. So the bolts didn't line up, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. For the center, I used a spade bit just to have a big enough hole for a router bit to actually fit through. I drilled on both sides so that it didn't tear out the plywood, especially on the top, because I need that to be as smooth as possible. And then I set about removing the material that I talked about so that the router would sit inside of the plate a little bit, because 18mm is too thick to have a useful router depth once it's fully plunged, if that makes sense. So that the bolts I'm using don't sit proud of the surface once I've mounted the router, I countersunk them a little bit and then I pre-drilled them in so that I could get the alignment all working up. And this is where I faced the issues I was talking about earlier with my non-straight drilled holes. Because as you can see in a second, as I drive these bolts in, it ended up just pushing the router in and not lining up with the bolt holes. And the solution to this was fairly simple. I just drilled the holes to be a little bit wider, and then that gave me enough wiggle room to get the bolts lined up. I've edited that to make it look like it was relatively fast, but I was there for a long time and couldn't be bothered to take the router off to cut the plate down to size, so don't recommend doing this, but that's what I did. I then put the hooks in. I don't know why I did it at this stage, but regardless, I put them in on the wrong side, so later in the video you'll see they magically move to the correct side of this plate. But the next thing to do was to cut the hole in the workbench so that this plate can sit within it, and that's what I'm doing here. With the hole cut and a little bit of sanding done to it, it was time to try and mount the plate inside of it, and I needed obviously a lip for the plate to sit onto, and I was too lazy to build a proper lip by like half-lapping the plate and then the tabletop, so instead what I've done is I've ripped down some scrap plywood that I had into a couple of strips. I then break these strips in half, and that's going to let me mount them to the underside of each corner to create a little platform that the router plate can sit on. With that done, it was time for battle number 2. Problem was I didn't cut the hole big enough, and I then spent a long time, let's just call it a long time, sanding it and taking a chisel to it, to both this and to the plate, to try and make this fit. And I've made it look, again, quite fast in this edit, but trust me, it was not. It was painful. And at the end of it, it did fit, but it was way too tight, and I should probably come back and actually make this even better, but yeah, we got there in the end, and that's all that matters. Okay, so with the router mounted to a plate, and the plate now mounted to the table, it's time to build the mechanism that will allow the router to plunge upwards and downwards, and thus move the bit upwards and down to the height that I need it to be. So I started by cutting down the middle pipe just to the length that it would need it to be, which was the width of the plate, and then I had to file down the edges of that, which is what I'm doing here. And there you go. Very proud of my filing. And I then cut the wooden strip that is going to be what the threaded rod runs through, and I cut that down to the same width as the hooks. So the first thing to do was to destroy the bit of plywood by completely blowing out the back of it, and once that was done, I could press on by putting the threaded insert into it. I started this off just with a couple taps of the hammer and then drove it all the way in with a vise, which I thought was the best way to do it in a straight line. Next thing then was to get the hole for the threaded bolt to sit within. Again, I completely destroyed the plywood, which is a theme, and then I realized I did it in the wrong order. I should have countersunk first and then used the correct size drill bit to go through. As you can see, there's no way for the spade bit to sit where I needed it to. My solution to this was to drill a starter hole in a scrap bit of MDF, which I can then center on the hole, as you can see here. And once that's clamped into place, I could then just use that to start the spade bit, and that allows me to countersink the hole that I need. Right, now it's time to build the mechanism itself, and what I'm doing here is I'm connecting the first bolt to another bit of threaded rod, and I'm doing that via a series of bolts and these longer bolts here that are gonna end up being locked together to join this bolt to the bit of threaded rod. You could achieve this with one really long bolt, but I couldn't find one. So yes, what I'm doing is cutting the threaded rod down to size here, and then I'll talk in a little bit about how this is all going to work and connect. So with all the parts in their rough places, it was time to lock them together, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk through how that works. So I've got this first bolt with the red arrow and the second one also with the red arrow, and if I twist them in opposite directions, they should lock together. And if I then do the same thing for this green pair, and then finally the same thing for this pink pair, all of those bolts will be locked together and won't be able to move as you end up twisting the whole mechanism, which should mean that it's all stuck and works as one cohesive unit. With all those tightened up, I'll demonstrate in a second what I meant by locking them together. So the first threaded bolt that goes through the plate is locked to the threaded rod. And you can see here, when I twist the threaded rod, it twists the whole unit, and the same will be true if you were to twist the first bolt that goes through the plate. With that done, I now needed to lock off the plunge mechanism, so I did this just with a zip tie, and I needed to do the same for the power trigger, which I actually did a little bit later, which is why the metal pole's there, but ignore that, I'm just showing the zip ties all together. So with that done, I now needed to just basically assemble it. So I pre-drilled a couple holes and drove a screw in so that the chain was held through this metal pole, and I could then measure how long I needed the chain to be in order for it to hook onto that hook. And with that measured, I could just cut that down with a hacksaw, and there you go. I just repeat that for the other side, and then I've got two lengths of chain that are the perfect length, and I've basically got all the components of the lift mechanism now, so it's just time to assemble. You should be able to see as I'm twisting the rod, it tensions the chains, and I'm going to explain how it works here. They're a bit loose, but all you do is you need to bring that down basically. So you tighten this up just by twisting it. That starts to pull this down, and as you can see, the chain is now tight. So with the mechanism all put together, it's just time to start testing whether or not it works. And the next couple of minutes of this video are what I'll refer to as troubleshooting. In the first instance, the trouble I faced was that I completely broke it. Broke. So I think this was idiocy on my part, but the thing came out. I think that should be mounted on the on the top. So I'll do that the correct way. It's pretty tight. Now, as you're going to see here, that did fix it exploding, but it didn't fix the fact that the router bit only came out about 2mm, which isn't very useful. So the next thing was to figure out how to make it plunge a bit further. It's been a process. So, where I'm at is I've decided, or realised, that you can push the router up and down and that puts slack on or off this chain. So I've gone 2 runs in, which leaves the arms at a bit of a higher angle, which in theory means that it will plunge faster. I moved the router a bit so it wasn't shoved all the way in, because I don't think it needs to be. So, from this side, it's currently squashed, as you can see. But what happens is, I get a drill. I'm gonna undo it this time. So as I drill, that pushes the screw, that undoes the lever, and as you can see, the bit goes down until it's down below, and then I'll do it in reverse. Let's zoom in a bit as well this time. Flick it. Okay, so as I put the trigger on, it's pulling that up. Excellent. How do you change the bit? And I don't know, is the answer. So what I'm going to try and do is figure that out. So I think if I hold that, there you go. It is sticking up. It's not fully out. It is also not fully centered, so I need to make that a bit wider. I ended up changing the bit here because I didn't want to die, and then I decided to test it and nearly died. So, as you see here, I think I need to build a fence. As fence builds go, this one is not going to win any awards, but it was simple and did the job for me. So I started off just by measuring the length of the wood so that it was the same length as the table. And with that done, I could just use these little handy corner clamp things to hold them together while I pre-drilled and screwed in a few screws. This is slightly confusing, but I used my new fence to set the table saw fence to be the same width as that fence, and then I ripped a bit of plywood to be the same width as the new fence that I built. Now these bits of plywood are going to form the lip that sits over the edge of the table, and so I just measured it against the fence itself, and then I cut them to length on the table saw, and for aesthetic reasons I cut off these corners using this handy little jig thing that I made. To assemble it all together, I just used a couple of nails and shot those in, and I then came back and... oh, that's loud, isn't it? Jeez. Came back and pre-drilled and then screwed those in just to add a little bit of strength. How's it go? With the fence assembled, all that was left to do was to make some form of mechanism that'll allow me to lock it into place when I need it to be. And I chose to do this just with another threaded insert, which when I insert a threaded rod and a handle through, I can just twist and that'll push into the table itself and lock the fence into place. Should. Handle. In place. And tighten that. Now, as with the mistake I made earlier, I mounted the threaded insert on the wrong side, so it ended up just being pulled out as I tightened the handle. So I moved it to the other side by countersinking a little hole, and with that done, it was fixed and the whole mechanism worked. And as you can see there, the fence now locked into place. Lock. And then lock it in. Final stages of the fence build then is to cut a hole out so that the fence can sit above the router bit a little bit if I don't need to use the whole bit. So I did this with a spade bit and just completely destroyed the nice new fence I built. But with that done, I just used a saw to take a little chamfer off the edge, and it looked like crap, as you can see in the background, but it seemed to work. With that done, I could finally start actually testing the router table itself. So I set the fence and then ran this bit of wood through it. This is at normal speed just to demonstrate. For other clips I'll speed it up, but yeah, this is the first pass I did, and you can see it did a pretty good job of taking the corner out and routing, I guess. There you go. It's done a pretty good job. Now the router table was working really well, but as you can see, it's also kicking out a lot of dust. And if I was going to use this for a project, I think I wanted to resolve that. So I got the plastic dust extraction bit that came with the router itself, and I basically just came up with this simple solution to box it in on the back of the fence. So I used this bit of card, sketched out the outline of it. Once I drill the hole out and attach a shop vac to it, it should, in theory, help with the dust collection situation. Okay. And with that done, it was time to test it. You can see already that there's a big improvement in the amount of dust it's kicking out. It's not zero dust, but I don't think any system I build will be zero dust, but this is now an acceptable level where I'm not just covering the table in dust with every single pass that I do. And that's the router table build done and dusted. If you, oh, that's terrible. Anyway, yeah, if you like stuff like this, this is really the central theme of my channel, is that I build the tools and my whole workshop out. And eventually I'll get to a point where I can hopefully build things. But yeah, we're not there yet. Got a few more bits to go, but thanks.